Bill, I've known you for probably 10 years now.
Yeah.
It's been a while. You've had a couple different journeys since you and I have known each other. You joined Flexport, a company that's historically known for international, but you've been leading their domestic business. How's that going?
Good. So we do have a significant amount of ground freight, as you can imagine, right? So there was an immediate plug in there, an opportunity to drive improvements. Flexport's, it's been an interesting journey over the last year and a half. We've had a lot of, I'd say, changes. But fundamentally, Flexport was founded as a technology-driven forwarder, really to service small shippers and build a consumer-grade service for small shippers. And that journey continues to drive a lot of value for those shippers, and we're seeing a lot of success with that. It's been a pretty solid year for us as we go into 2025. But on the ground freight side particularly, there's been a lot of opportunity to drive improvement because as Flexport grew, it was, I'd say, very fragmented, very customer-centric, but on the ops side, often quite fragmented. So coming on board, it really is the trucking expert, is the ground freight expert. There was a significant opportunity to drive systems improvements and just consolidate a lot of how we did procurement and operations on that side. So it's been good.
Did Flexport have a surface operation before you joined?
We did. I would say that it was run more like a procurement team than a capability, meaning we thought of it more as just a cost center, and that's how it was traditionally managed. And so very small team, managing a limited set of carriers, low investment in technology, and not really built as a capability to go to market, and that's a pretty dramatic change as we think about what we've done, and of course with the Convoy platform acquisition and the pieces, it's all kind of coming together as just a much more of something we can sell and go to market with as a capability versus just a cost center.
Was the original sort of foundation of that was sort of door to door for existing international forwarding? Was that the idea?
Yeah, because we have a very high attachment rate, much higher than most NVOCCs. Attachment rate meaning the percent of freight where we manage the ground transportation leg versus just being port to port. Part of that is because our customer base, we've got 6,000 customers, by and large they're like small to mid-sized shippers. So just managing the full transaction is easier versus other NVOCCs tend to work with larger shippers for which they have direct, BCO, they have direct relationships with the steam lines. They can manage those things independently, and they have direct drayage relationships, right? So like a Walmart would have their own direct drayage bid versus a small shipper that's just not shipping as much. They're more likely to go with an end-to-end provider and door-to-door service.
Yeah, I mean, Flexport, as I understand the history of the business, was really built to sort of serve small SMB shippers. That logistics, I think of Shopify. I mean, there's actually a lot of analogies in history with Shopify, but I run some e-commerce businesses in addition to this, and I use Shopify because it's turnkey. I don't have to know how to code anything. Payments are automated.
So if I get a flying cap,
you can flying cap the Space Store. By the way, if you go to the Space Store on the way to tonight's party, it's 15% off if you use the code F3. So please visit the Space Store. It's right by Freight Alley on Market Street. So that's my plug.
All right.
Thanks. Yeah. I was told to.
Like queued you right up there.
Yeah. Coupon F3. But no, I use Shopify as a turnkey, and that was sort of the idea for Flexport, right? Was the original idea that small shippers, particularly in e-commerce, would not understand the mechanics of international freight.
Yes, exactly. And Ryan always likes to tell stories about when he was shipping and trying to build a business.
Like a motorcycle business, didn't he?
Yeah, like reselling electric scooters. And,
like mopeds or something?
Yeah.
Crazy.
How complicated it was, and that was kind of that motivated part of the journey of the vision for Flexport initially.
Okay, so let's talk about your sort of role. So you were at Uber Freight.
Yep.
One of the more infamous companies that, has now established itself through the acquisition of Transplace. I don't know if you saw David Parker in my conversation this morning about Transplace, the foundation of Transplace. Oh. But Uber Freight is obviously a very well established. You are a part of building that business to where it is. Why did you leave Uber to go to Flexport? What was the primary driver for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I still have a lot of attachment to what we built at Uber Freight. It's a great team. I think they got a great product. The journey of that company definitely shifted, and we did the Transplace acquisition. So as a company, it was evolving and going in a very different direction than we initially set out. Because the initial journey with Uber Freight or Convoy, right, which we can get into that conversation, I imagine, was this vision of digital freight management, right? And how do you automate the back end and use technology to drive a truly automated freight broker where you don't have like a carrier sales teams booking. I mean, everybody I think understands the story now because we're 8 years into it. But that was one piece, and with the Transplace acquisition, the company was evolving in a lot of different directions. Not only that, but then the CEO at the time of Flexport had reached out, and there was an opportunity to really take that same idea and apply it internationally and build within the context of a global forwarder. It was very compelling. I was very compelled by Flexport as a technology company, and it was very unique. It was an opportunity to learn new things, kind of build a whole new type of capability, and to do that in drayage and cartage and other ground services, and to do that internationally. So that was the big motivating factor initially. Of course, a lot changed since
You
then.
actually, if I'm not, David Clark was actually the
that's
person that recruited you in.
Yes.
You actually joined at the time of transition, or maybe right before it.
6 months. Yeah.
Oh, it was that long.
Yeah,
See, like in freight world, it's hard to keep track of the dates.
Yes.
You joined, and then you saw this sort of complete change in culture. Ryan came in, obviously that was well written, well talked about, and then you guys bought Convoy.
That's right. Well, it all happened, that happened relatively quickly because it was like September and then, October, November is when the whole Convoy deal came through.
Yeah, I think I've told you this, and the audience may not know it, but when I was actually at a courthouse not too far from here on a rezoning issue for a property I owned, and my phone started blowing up about Convoy. You were the first person I called, because like Dan would not call back. I don't know if Brooks or Dan are in the, Dan's gone, he went to Atlanta, but Brooks may be in the room. And I always told them, like, if there was a story, I'd call them. There was a lot of rumors about Convoy, and I'm like, I'll call you first to get you. Neither of them want to call me back, but I called you, I was like, hey, what do you know? 2 weeks later, you guys are the owner of Convoy.
Yeah.
What was, like, how did that come about? It happened pretty quickly. At least, I mean, at the time you and I talked,
it happened very quickly.
Nobody even knew that Convoy was shutting down.
I think there's a lot of details I probably can't get into, but I think Ryan and I both had previous relationship with Dan, so we were able to get a hold of him very quickly.
Yeah.
Facilitate that. And I think ultimately it made a lot of sense if you look at it just holistically, because the Convoy team, mainly in Seattle, we had a strong team in Seattle. There's a lot of, if you look at that team, there's a lot of resume overlap. There's a lot of cultural, I think, affinity. We are a tech company. It was clear to that team that this would be a safe place to land. And of course, my background with Uber Freight, a lot of familiarity, that was just just one of these amazing alignments of like the stars. So I think that as well was a motivating factor, and it just made sense in the end, and we were able to pull together. And our vision, our intent always was to bring it back and to find a way to make this into like a build a viable business around it, and because I do fundamentally believe in the model and I believe in the technology. And I had a conversation with somebody just yesterday, and after the Dan conversation, where I do think it's in 5 years to 10 years from now, every broker will look like Convoy or Uber Freight. I fundamentally believe that. I mean, I believe the tech that has been introduced to the market will change the market, and that is driving a trend. And this is not a fast-moving market, so I think it's more just that adoption is slow. But now, with all the companies you're seeing, both in AI, but just broadly in tech in this space, you're seeing this rapid, I think, democratization of a lot of what was built at Convoy and Uber Freight, and adoption across a lot of carriers. I see it every day as I go on site with brokers. Just the tools they're using today, the level of automation, a lot of that is what we had built in these companies for our own use, and now it's available in many places.
Why do you think they end up like Uber? Why do you think they end up like Uber or Convoy? Like, what's the?
Because if you look at those companies, so there's a couple reasons why the model didn't ultimately work, and one of those
Convoy's business model.
Yeah, well, just in general.
The digitization.
Well, we didn't maybe get the level of automation we expected out of the gate. We did get it on the carrier side, and the carrier procurement was very highly automated. And if you look at actual kind of OpEx per load, it was a very aggressive and progressive trajectory for both those companies versus where the benchmark is. And that was driven by things like the apps and the fact that carriers are booking on apps and the owner-operator adoption of this kind of app-centric momentum. The reason I say that I think more companies will look like that is because, one, I think through the pandemic there was an increasing focus on OpEx reduction and getting OpEx down, and that continues to be an obsession with every broker that I talk to, particularly through the bear market. To get that down, you either need to outsource or you need to leverage technology intelligently. I think there's a lot of solutions out here now that allow for the leveraging of technology to lower the carrier sourcing cost, or as you saw the AI demos, right, directly to maybe replace some of those more rote positions. And the reason I say that is that I don't think a broker will be able to compete without an OpEx that is significantly more competitive than what it has been over time. And I think those brokers that are able to embrace tech, outsourcing, combination thereof, restructure their processes where they can get their procurement processes to a level of automation equivalent to what a Uber or Convoy were able to achieve, I think you won't be able to compete in 10 years if you're not in that position.
I mean, when you started on your journey for digitization, there was a belief that having the technology would give an enormous advantage. The marketplace technology would give, whether it's Uber or Convoy or Transfix or loads, like we can name the dozens of companies that were marketplaces. It's actually been the case that, and David Bell, I don't know if you saw David Bell's conversation, the lean staffing right before we went to lunch, is that what actually happened is that technology was democratized. I mean, you could walk on the floor and see companies that roughly created the same equivalency. And then you had the RXOs, and you had the incumbents, the Echoes, and all these others that were able to create essentially the same playing field, but even the smallest brokers were able to do that. Do you actually think that we end up seeing a situation where that there does become a differentiation through technology, or do you think something fundamentally different shifts?
I think it will be harder to differentiate via technology. I think this is where, if you had asked me when we founded Uber Freight, if at that time whether the market would consolidate or deconsolidate, I would have said it's going to consolidate because technology is going to create
brokerage specific.
Yeah, I would have expected in 2016 that brokerages would consolidate because technology would create a barrier to entry. Mm-hmm. I think now what you've seen is exactly what you outlined. There's been a democratization of these capabilities, and in many cases, the tech that has been brought to market more broadly is better than the tech that many of the larger brokers have built in-house.
Yeah.
Right, so that thereby democratizes and leads to, I think, ongoing fragmentation. And why, like every successful broker is typically driven by like strong commercial relationships, and it is and continues to be a relationship-driven business. And I think on the shipper side and on the commercial side, as well as with mid-size and large carriers, that will continue to be the case. Like, tech can only go so far, and tech can automate all of the rote tasks, all the standard tasks. Tech can re-engineer a lot of your processes, but you still have people making the sale, people making the close. Will brokers get more efficient? Yes. But again, this is where the ability for the average broker to get more efficient is now multiple times better than it was 10 years ago. And and again, back to the why will they look like Uber Freight or Convoy? Because they've built all these tools and all these capabilities just for themselves. And again, some of the capabilities in those companies is not as good as some of the third-party tools that are out there now in terms of what you can use for like email automation and pricing and all the other tools that have come to market.
I mean, there's been such a venture capital has not only funded the companies, and so much of the effort and capital went into sourcing freight to build, quote unquote, as Dan likes to say, liquidity in the marketplace. And I had the opportunity to talk to Drew from Transfix last night, and I think a lot of the same sort of fundamentals is so much effort went into, and money and capital and resources went into driving the marketplace business or the brokerage business, and not enough was left towards the other tech. The other tech things. Now, that wasn't true of everybody. I mean, Convoy was blessed with the best roster of investors. And I think the reason you guys bought Convoy was because the technology stack was actually legit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you've now deployed it as Convoy for brokers.
Yeah, and this is kind of building on this theme. So the Convoy platform, as we brought it back to market, it's like, where was the value in this tech? Where can we immediately get leverage? And we have pivoted to we are taking the platform and only selling it to brokers on one end and enabling carriers on the other end. And why is that? Well, if you look at where Convoy is truly differentiated, the app and the experience for carriers was one area where immediately I saw a differentiation, meaning the average carrier on our platform prefers to use Convoy as the platform where they book loads. So why is that? Because it's a well-engineered end-to-end experience. They know they're going to get paid. The information's vetted. It's very easy to use. And this is where it's now a third-party technology we're bringing to market, which is better than a lot of the other efforts that have come to market in terms of load applications. And I know now I can bring it to other brokers and give them that same access. But it works. It's a point solution. It's not a solution. It doesn't do all things in the sense of it allows them to access small carriers and owner-operators directly, very efficiently through what I believe to be the best technology. But they still need to build their mid-market carrier relationships. They still need to manage the shipper side relationships, right? It's just one piece of the puzzle, but it's a piece that had $1 billion plus in investment and has very differentiated technology, and which is an accelerator enabler and can automate a significant chunk of your operations, because historically working with owner operators is one of the most difficult things to do as a broker. It's much more labor intensive, your OpEx is much higher, and now all of a sudden you can plug in a solution where you get all this investment in this totally engineered end-to-end automated solution it's got all the exception management, the payments, the fraud, like all of that capability, and anybody can plug into it.
But isn't that what the load boards do? I mean, it's what DAT would argue that,
I see some load boards in the room. I think there's always going to be a place for the load board. Load boards, I think, have a challenge that they're going to have to engineer out of, which is they have to be all things to all people, and that it's like the innovator's dilemma, because they have a much broader spectrum of technical capabilities among their user base and adoption, as we bring it to market, we can be much more filtered on both sides of the marketplace, because to engage in our platform, the carriers have to use the app. They have to book on the app. They have to manage a load through the app, right? That experience is locked in. So I won't have a fragmentation of the carrier experience, right? And on the broker side, well, it has to be integrated and it has to have that. We've got to be able to tender, track, pay, like all that capability has to be engineered in. So by locking that in, it's by default a more complete experience. The analogy that I've used before, which the load boards are not going to like, is the Craigslist versus Amazon experience, where like on one of them, they're both marketplaces, they're both places you go to buy things where you're matching buyers and sellers, but one of them is obviously a much more holistic experience, right, than the other.
I mean, one has a controlled environment.
Yes, controlled
one
environment.
One is uncontrolled.
One's open.
I mean, the issue, like load fraud, freight fraud is a massive, massive problem. A lot of that freight fraud is propagated on the load boards because the lack of control, the lack of vetting. Are you suggesting that a more controlled environment will mitigate the vast majority of the load board fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. You're queuing me right up for this.
By the way,
I know we didn't have any talk
just so everybody's clear, I haven't even prepped. I don't do prep calls, so we're literally out there. So.
We've had 0 thefts on the platform since 2 quarters before Convoy wound down. And why is that? Well, they made a significant investment in fraud detection, but also because we have just more information available. When you're managing that transaction end to end, you have the device information, you have their phone number, you have the driver information. You can see where they're going. You can see if that driver gets a new cell phone, but they're in the same location, their origin is the same. Maybe that's a concern, right? You can build a network graph between individuals and that and start to draw connections between multiple entities. That's a capability that Convoy invested quite heavily in before winding down, that I think is very unique on the platform. We have not had a single theft on the platform.
Not a single load board issue.
Which I don't think many people can say that.
Well, we heard even Cindy this morning, running a small brokerage here in Chattanooga, was talking about her own experience with load board fraud. I mean, it's such a major issue. One of the, always been this sort of rub, and I've seen this in multiple cases. It was an issue with Convoy for brokers where, it was an issue at Transplace, these managed logistics operations, but also have a brokerage, how are you, Keep Trucking found this out the hard way, is they went and bought a brokerage, thinking they could then bring brokers online. How do you go to a broker and say, hey, you're in the business of also moving freight.
Yep.
How does a broker feel comfortable handing over the reins of their business to a platform?
So this is a key pivot we made. We are not building a Convoy broker. We are not selling first-party freight. We actually partner with brokers, including some in the audience, for our own freight. And we contract with brokers for Flexport freight. We don't sell first. There is no Convoy broker. So we decided that.
Was that once you bought Convoy, it became a pivot? Was that right?
Because
at one point you were in
when we bought it, we thought, okay, well, we'll spin all this back up and we'll go down this direction again. But we had such positive engagement from the broker community, and because of this exact conversation, we decided, you know what, it's not, there's a lot more, I think there's a lot more value to the market of us building this as a neutral technology that we can sell to brokers versus us trying to build a broker around it.
I remember having this conversation with Brooks a while ago, and just that was the concern, is like, how do you go to the brokers? How does Convoy, as a broker at the time when they were an independent company, how do they go to the brokers and convince them to convert freight? Because that always was the issue that always is, if you're in the marketplace business, truly in a neutral marketplace, you can't really be in the freight. I had this conversation with Schwab at Keep Trucking years ago.
Well, and you know, the Silver's bang this drum all the time, because it was like, I remember Jeff telling me this exact thing, you got to be a tech company or a broker, you can't pick both. And like all this, and yeah, that's definitely a theme that comes up, and I know there's been conversation about that recently. And you know, that was my product at Uber, was we launched that and brought it to market, and I think ultimately, you know, what they're doing it as clean as they can, and as well. And I think it's good to have this competition. Like there is that difference in positioning. Every broker's got to make their own decision around that in terms of how they want to go to market. I knew for us it was just going to be much easier, because there are certainly, particularly as you get to some of the larger brokers, where they want to know we're not going to be in the mix. And
how do they? I mean, this going back to the Amazon analogy. Years ago, Toys R Us said, "Take our toys, manage our marketplace." There was a moment where Amazon said, I can be in the toy business, and just completely destroyed. I mean, this is a legendary, talk about business wars. It's actually, I think, a business wars episode. How does a broker that's in the room that says, this is really compelling, but how do I know that I can trust Flexport that in 5 years, they're not going to disintermediate me?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I would say strategically, so one, I have no interest in doing it again. I'll just say that right now.
Being a freight broker is hard, right?
Having done it before, yes, it's very hard. It's a very different business model, and from a strategic focus and a resourcing focus and like overall prioritization, it's just very hard to balance both those things. And you know, I worked at Amazon for 2 years, and that's one of the very interesting things with Amazon is, they do a million different things. You have a lot of autonomy at a low level. It actually gets, as you rise up and you try to do kind of cross-divisional things, it gets much more challenging. There's an interesting, like Amazon is a very interesting company and very entrepreneurial, and it's a good example because they do compete everywhere, and they compete against themselves. I remember internally we had multiple initiatives that were overlapping, right, and slightly competing against each other. And I think they can pull it off at scale, and you know, they've got the momentum and the leverage to get to a point where, you know, they just like they're too big. I think for us, it's a much cleaner model. I don't see we are doubling down on our partnerships with brokerages internally. So we're raising that tax. It's going to get harder and harder and harder for us, not easier. There's not going to be a point where it's like, oh, we could potentially switch, right? Because we're making it like, we would undermine the model as we go forward, and we build momentum and we build trust. So I have like no interest in doing that or flipping this from a model perspective, because ultimately we want to partner with brokers within our business. We want to build the momentum, the density on the platform on that side.
I mean, if you're successful, and you know, I imagine your track record, the resources you guys have in building you'll be successful at some level. If you're really successful, then arguably DAT and Truck Stop have an enormous, it's their market to lose. It's a duopoly of where they have largely been able to protect this really, you know, world of their own, unto their own. And a lot of people have tried to disintermediate that and been very unsuccessful. But if you're actually successful, you could potentially disintermediate them. How are you thinking about the load board's future if you are successful?
It's a good question. I mean, we still have Craigslist, eBay, Amazon, right? I think it's a huge market. So I can't see that totally going away, because there's always going to be a use case where with a platform that's just totally open, and as where ours is a little more closed and curated. So I do think it's hard to say how things evolve. Certainly I believe in what we're building. I think it's differentiated. I do think it can displace a lot of that function in terms of access to owner-operators. And you know, our goal, of course, is to build the best experience for those owner-operators or for the brokers, so that they feel that they can just manage freight through the platform and not have to go to a load board to post a freight. But I can't see it totally going away, so it's hard to predict.
I mean, look, it strikes me, and I think, and I'll say this, and I've said this publicly, is I think the load boards themselves have an enormous responsibility for the freight fraud. I think they should be, their business model is dependent upon them controlling and managing, and because that is where the freight fraud is propagating. It's the same thing, and I wrote an op-ed a few days ago about the credit card industry had this problem. MasterCard and Visa, at one point were like, hey, it's not our problem if our credit cards get stolen. But they realized that e-commerce would never survive if people's credit cards would be compromised. They created the PCI standards. And I think that the load boards have a responsibility to also take, now ChuckStop has been certainly more publicly addressing the problem than I think DAT has. They have the benefit of having a fraud management system part of it. But I do think the load boards have responsibility here. Now what you're saying is, and I'd like for you to unpack this for a second, how are you able to achieve zero fraud where in those marketplaces it's obviously, we see fraud being propagated?
Well, we do have more specific information, and we have tracking information, breadcrumb data, location information, individual driver information, device information. And so if you view it as a set of individual bad actors that are moving between carriers, which is mainly the case, right? You have drivers that are moving between bad actors, getting new MC numbers. The actual pool of bad actors is not that large, then it's easier to draw those connections. If you don't have that, if you're dealing with the abstraction of the carrier, it just adds one more layer of difficulty, right? Because you have a lot of cases, as an example, where, because MC numbers are for sale, right? And people,
MC numbers are for sale, Glendale, Arizona, like
people will buy a carrier and the bank account and the whole thing and flip it bad, right?
Yeah.
So those are very hard to catch if you don't have the information. If you're not, and also we mainly deal with owner operators and small carriers, so they're logging in and they've got to log in and they've got to deal with the application. That's a filter. That is a very strong filter for us to be able to identify user level data, which we can then draw those sorts of connections.
And is the opportunity for Flexport really that partnering with domestic-oriented freight brokers means that you also can get international forwarding freight when there's opportunities that come up? Or is it the other way around where you guys are bringing business to the freight brokers?
There's a little bit of both, right? It's like there's so many complicated relationships in this industry. Because there are definitely forwarders for which we are competitive, where that's part of the conversation, or maybe they own a broker, a forwarder owns a broker owns a drayage. So on that side, yes, we're more sensitive to the competitive concerns if a forwarder is directly competitive in terms of engaging. But it's really case by case. Like everyone's a little bit different, and things may look like they overlap, but they don't, or they only overlap in the edges. And I've never been at a freight company where you didn't have some kind of semi-competitive relationships with other providers.
Yeah, it's co-opetition.
Yeah,
one of the most classic folks in the room may appreciate this. They may not appreciate, some of these folks may not. The old JB Hunt BNSF lawsuit is these are very codependent businesses that end up suing one another. And it's just interesting how it's the Samsung, Apple, these businesses are highly, highly dependent on one another, but co-opetition does take place across the industry. Bill, I wish that they would have given us 45 minutes because you and I could keep talking. We always run out of time before we run out of topics. I have to ask before you go, I've come out publicly and we've had a lot of conversation about the market. Just for a few minutes, because I think everyone would love to hear, how are you feeling about the freight market?
I'm optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic. Our plans going into next year are, so I want to believe. Planning for flat, hoping for best. That's what
you were one of the folks that told me a couple years ago, this was over email, the downturn is coming and there's so many people who won't experience that. Like, you have been through multiple cycles. We know what a cycle can be really painful, 2008 cycle. You're not ready to resign to the fact the freight recession's over.
I'm 60% there. I'm 60%
well,
there.
Hopefully you'll come up as we get more data. If I'm right, then...
If I was going to vote, I would say yes. If it was a yes or no, I'd say...
The binary.
Yeah.
Poly market, 60%.
Yes, yeah. If I had to place a bet.
We actually should do a poly market.
Yeah.
Have Ryan put a poly market bet on is the great freight recession over. I'd like to know what the... Is anyone here do poly market?
Do we want to take hands?
Yeah. Okay, so let's do that. Raise your hand if you think the great freight recession is over. Is it dead? Are we going to count?
Well, that doesn't look like a majority.
Not a very scientific. We need some octopus OCR.
Yeah.
All right, if you think the great freight recession is still going on, raise your hand.
I don't know.
It's like half.
Yeah.
I would say 60-40 feels about right for this, yeah. If you don't have a clue or don't care, raise your hand. Okay, everybody cares. I see one. I think you're just scratching your head. So anyways, Bill, awesome conversation. Appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
Yeah.
And we'll have you back. Next time we'll get 45. We always say that.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Thank you.